Shavua Tov, everyone. So glad to see you all. Today's our last shiur for Sefer Ezra Nechemia. We actually finished the text. We finished learning the text last week. And today we have a relatively short class because, as you all know, based on all the WhatsApps that we've been having all day, Mincha is much earlier, so we can't really go too late. So we'll finish around 6:25-ish to allow people to get to Mincha. But I planned it this way because today, basically, I just have my final remarks about Sefer Ezra and Nechemia. I can't really summarize both books properly in this amount of time because really, if I would summarize, I'd have to go back and mull it all through again. And we've done that. We've done that for almost 30 classes, 29 classes. Today's class number 30. So I'll just go back and say very simply, Sefer Ezra that we studied has 10 chapters. Goes until Perek Yud. But in reality, half of it isn't even in the period of Ezra HaSofer, but rather right after Am Yisrael were given the charter, the ability to come back to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, and build the Beit HaMikdash, which was, give or take, between 80 and 100 years before Ezra even appeared. And Sefer Nechemia that we just finished last week is 13 pages, 13 prakim. And Nechemia comes about 12 years after Ezra came. And what I want to do now is just really give you my thoughts on these two great leaders and on what they have done. And if anybody wants to chime in when I'm done afterwards and share their own remarks, harei zeh mevorach. So, as we all know, Nechemia, he built a wall around Yerushalayim. That probably was one of his greatest achievements. He repaired the economic gap, right, between the rich and the poor. He restored the work in the Beit HaMikdash, and he returned the Trumot u'Ma'asrot to the Kohanim and to the Leviim in order to bring back the Seder Avodah. And he reestablished the observance of Shabbat, which is very, very important. We saw that as well. And he tried as much as he can to deal with intermarriage. He had opposition. The opposition to Nechemia, to these reforms, both to Ezra and Nechemia, they came basically because of economic deterioration in the region, right? Especially from the rich and all the different officials that existed prior to Ezra and Nechemia's arrival, and a deterioration in the relationship as well between all the neighbors neighboring Yerushalayim. We call it Yehuda, which is the region, Achvat Yehuda. And there was a fear that the Jewish people now returning to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, to the region, they were gaining strength. And there was this fear that the existence or the existing balance of power in the land of Israel before Ezra and Nechemia came would be undermined. In particular, we spent time on this, the relationship between Am Yisrael and the Shomronim. And the Jews were all affected by this. And the Shomronim became very, very strong, and they saw themselves as Jews. This is going back to Sefer Ezra. But Ezra and Nechemia, they didn't want to see these Shomronim as Jews, and they were removed from the circle of Yahadut, of Judaism, following the expulsion of women, and also those who were working at the time in the Beit HaMikdash. We saw that in Sefer Ezra, and he came in and he purified the Avodah, and he got rid of all those who were foreigners, and he ensured that just the Kohanim and the Leviim would work in the Beit HaMikdash. But in addition to these non-Jewish opponents, the Shomronim, Ashdodim, Sambalat, Tuvia, the Ammoni, Geshem, Ha'aravi as well, the Ashdodim, there were also, as always, Jewish opponents. And among them were, for instance, we mentioned Shmaya ben Daliah. There was a woman called Noadiah Neviah, And this opposition, Jewish opposition, stemmed from Nechemia's demand for the return of their fields, shmitat karkaot, to their previous owners. And people didn't want to lose their money. But it was what the Torah, teaches us. And as well, the reluctance of these families, aristocracy, to expel their wives and break up their Jewish families or non-Jewish families. So the fact that both secular and religious authority were undermined, for example, the status of HaKohen HaGadol, Eliashib, we saw that a couple of weeks ago. And Nehemiah's goals also somewhat contradicted the wishes of all the nobles, right? They had different ideas than what Nehemiah had. So we have to check back to the surrounding nations because they caused quite a bit of friction. And this friction that existed not just with the Shomronim, but with all the nations around, there were basically two approaches that arose in our society. One was the separatists, the Shita Badlanit. It was an approach. It was the approach that Ezra Nechemia took. They basically wanted to build a buffer between all the groups of Am Yisrael and everyone else. And Ezra Nechemia, they headed this approach. The expulsion of the non-Jewish women, that was the most important thing to them. You have to first separate. And the observance of the laws of Torah, also separation, so that it would help strengthen Judaism. And this separatism would later on help the people foster their observance, since they wouldn't be adversely affected by the customs of all the surrounding nations, which is one of the reasons why it was so important for both Ezra and Nehemiah to have all of these people expel their women. Because as a result, and this is something historic that we see all the way from Sefer Shoftim, all the way down to Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, God will not punish them. And there will be no conquest against them, as it was in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, that basically destroyed Beit HaMikdash. Because after all, it's all about faith in God. Punishment comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from the heaven. Why? For distancing from leaving the path and the way of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To maintain this principle that we mentioned in both Sfarim, Am Sgula and Zera Kodesh, and not to assimilate with Gentiles, right? And so, at the end, the idea was that all of these Jews living in Yerushalayim would come to a spiritual resurrection without the influence of the pagan beliefs of all the surrounding nations. So that was very important to both Ezra and Nehemiah. In addition, it's also possible that the expulsion of the non-Jewish women, I think this is even probably more than possible. I think it's probable, right? They had political benefits, because when you expel them, there won't be any more negative influences from the different aristocracy and the families associated with the Jews. We saw that in Sefer Melachim with Achav and Izebel. For those who remember, when we learned together Sefer Melachim, Izebel controlled everything, right? So when you get rid of the non-Jewish wives who belong to these foreign surrounding nations, then you're creating a separation of state and government as well. And there's no more power stemming from these non-Jewish families. So these families, Sanballat, as we saw with Eliashib, for instance, or with Geshem and Tuvia, through their statuses of the expulsion of the women, they lose their leadership, right? So that was one approach, the separatism approach, and that was Ezra and Nehemiah. But we kept on seeing popping up all the time another approach, and that's why Ezra and Nehemiah kept on needing to come back and foster their relationship with Am Yisrael and bring back Torah, because there was always a group of people, and we met them, right? We met them. I'll remind you in a minute. This approach, we'll call it universalism, I guess, which basically included the rich, usually, some of the Kohanim who intermarried, and people who just wanted to see Yahadut, Judaism, spread across the globe. And it was seen as a positive thing, right? The The God of the Jews is the God of all nations. That's not new. This is not a new, it's a new concept then, but today we still have Jews who believe that. Jews who believe that, Yahadut, Judaism is supposed to be spread out throughout the entire world. Therefore, you can be a great Jew living anywhere in the world. You don't need to be in Israel. You can live in Timbuktu because your job is to show God to the world. And there were some people that believed in that. And therefore, these people emphasized that the Torah did not forbid marriage, relationships with all, nations, only with certain nations, certain people, like the Moavim and the Ammonim, which is mentioned in the Torah, but not the Shomronim, for instance. Hence, after Ezra tried to expel the women, they kept on marrying again these rich families because they wanted either power, or just belief that Judaism should be across the globe. What they didn't understand is what later on Nechemia tried to teach them, is that you lose Judaism that way. If you don't, that's why I call it separatism, badlanut, right? If you don't lock yourselves in a wall and seal yourself, I guess, making sure that you don't intermarry and learn from the other nations in a negative way, then you can secure Yahadut and Torah. So additionally, the marriage relationship with the neighbors, they thought would be good economically as well, which would bring great benefit. And that's a positive thing that they saw. Therefore, they kept on remarrying after they expelled them, or if they expelled them, we saw there were different approaches. We didn't see any evidence where they actually got divorced. In fact, we saw the possibility of gerut, right? The possibility of conversions. It's a little bit wishy-washy in the text itself, because we can see these great leaders, Ezra and Nechemia, maybe they didn't want to get into the kishkas of every single family. On the one hand, they broadcast to the world, yes, we need to expel, we need to separate. But halakha l'maaseh, practically, did they actually expel all the women? I don't know. So I would like to conclude and just say that Ezra and Nechemia they're trying to create a national religious society that operates in a uniform manner according to Torah laws and a clear way of life. They wanted to make sure that there's order in how you live a religious life. That there's order and halachas that they can follow. So that was very important to them. How did they succeed? Let's judge them, or not judge them, God forbid, but let's look at what each of them brought. Ezra. So let's take Ezra. Ezra had yichus. We mentioned that from the get-go. He was a descendant of Seraya Kohen, a descendant of a large and respected dynasty of the Kohanim, and it provided Ezra with leadership authority, because he comes from a very yichustic family. Wow, look at this man, where he comes from. The very fact that he was a scribe, a sofer, right? We mentioned a fast writer in the book of Moshe Rabbeinu, mentioned the Tzukim there, the beginning of Ezra, who knew how to interpret the Torah. It gave him authority even among the Persian Empire. So he was seen as an important man, a scholar. On the other hand, Nechemia probably took his place due to his many talents. There's no evidence of where he came from, of a lineage that was important. Talents. And we witnessed all those talents that he had following his successes as a leader in the political and in the statehood sense. So I guess, in my opinion, the difference between these two leaders are very obvious. Nechemia acted more forcefully, aggressively, and with authority. Right? His activities and what he did it's concentrated all around the political aspect of the community, especially by building projects designed to strengthen the place of the Jewish community against hostile elements from the environment, all the surrounding nations. He promoted social and religious reforms, it's true, but wasn't recognized as a religious authority figure for that reason. He was seen as a doer. Right, he was a doer. He the second he appeared as a leader, just a couple of days later, he was already, walking around the broken wall that was in ruins since already the time of Nebuchadnezzar, trying to see what he can do. And it was in stealth mode, and he was making sure that no one found out because he was a doer. He didn't want people to stop him. That's Nechemia. On the other hand, Ezra acted in the form of persuasion, koach hashichnua. Remember, he cried, he tore his garments, and he made an impression on Am Yisrael. But his main role, Ezra's main role, was the renewal of the Jewish community at the religious level. Ezra sought to connect Yehuda, the Yehudim, Jerusalem, with the harmony of the Jewish religion. That's what he really wanted. Ezra wanted to restore, I guess, practical religious Judaism. Halacha l'maaseh, so they can live a religious life. He saw this as preserving the people from punishment, number one, as well as purifying Judaism from all the idolatry of all the nations around, which was the first thing he saw when he came to Yerushalayim, which would lead to the return of Jewish avodah, seder avodah in Beit HaMikdash, mamlechet Yisrael. Hence, the enactment of rabbinic decrees that we saw, for instance, religious structure, right? Sometimes, when you have a gader, when you implement a halacha, a law, not necessarily from the Torah, but rabbinically, because you're trying to send a message and bring back structure and order, and that's what he did. The status given to him by Artaxerxes also allowed him to use force. As we mentioned, he came down to Eretz Yisrael, to Yerushalayim, with the license to be the authority to be everything, religiously and as far as the governor of the region. But Ezra preferred power of persuasion. Torah, in his mind, can't be taught by force. You can't accept Torah by force. So he tried to teach it to them. He was a true mechanech. He was similar to Moshe Rabbeinu in that aspect, that he wanted to teach Am Yisrael Torah, hoping that Torah will do it all. That when they learn, when they see it, when their eyes pop out with passion, they're like, wow, this is an amazing way to live. That was Ezra. Ezra developed a culture that encouraged religious unity in the land of Israel. Nechemia, on the other hand, carried out strong political activities, in addition to trying to continue Ezra's quest for spirituality. But he provided a physical, safe framework for the Jewish community. He brought security to the groups of people who were experiencing depression, and he gave them solid leadership. That's what he felt that they needed. We had Ezra for the spiritual aspect, and he felt he has to give them some type of framework, some kind of place, a safe haven. Perhaps it can be said that what Nechemia did for the body of the Jewish people, Ezra did for the souls of the Jewish people. So I guess, in conclusion, it's possible, I don't know, maybe it's not. Is it possible to decide which leadership is better or more successful? Is the religious leadership of Ezra, who advocated persuasion, submission, accepting religious worship out of love, the desired leadership, or is the leadership of Nechemia, who was more firm and aggressive, advocated physical construction, and believed in separatism? Is that maybe preferred? And we see that if you look just at the elections coming, you have parties that are saying, religious, and some that are saying we don't want. It's the never-ending cycle. What is the best type of leadership to lead Am Yisrael? It's interesting that the editors of Sefer Ezra and Nechemia, the books could have been called any name. It could have been called Sefer Shavei Tzion. Think about it, right? That's really what it's about. Sefer Shavei Tzion, or Sefer Binyan Mikdash, or whatever, right? But that's not what it was called. Instead, there's a reason why at the end they're called Ezra and Nechemia, after the leaders. So in my humble opinion, the message is that both are needed. I think it's an obvious thing to us all. A single leadership without its affiliation is not a recipe for success. You have to have both. And the message of these two books is that the people of Israel will survive only if, number one, they maintain their faith, emunah b'kadosh baruch hu, Torah mitzvot. But faith will thrive only if physical barriers are formed between their faith and the faith of their neighbors, as Nechemia did. And by the way, that exists today too. One of the struggles that all schools in the school system in Israel is trying to make that separation between Torat Israel and Tarbut Ma'arav, the Western culture. Trying to make these kids realize Judaism is different. Yes, we can take the good out of all these other cultures, but we cannot rely that these cultures will bring us to a better place. Instead, we look into Torah for that. That's what Ezra and Nechemia were trying to do. There's an emphasis. Also interesting, I think we saw this as we went through the books. The emphasis is on changing the concept from focusing on specific people to focusing on the community as a whole. We're no longer talking about Avraham Avinu or Moshe Rabbeinu. We're discussing the general public. Am Yisrael. All of a sudden, it's about the Am. It's not about the leader, right? We don't discuss stories that happens to the leaders. Rather, the leaders are telling us what's going on with the people, the nation. The focus, there's no discussion on or preoccupation about the manhig themselves, about Ezra, a little bit, just where they come from, but not about them. We don't hear stories like we do with Moshe, like we do with Avram, Yitzchak, and even Yoshua, but rather the focus is on the people. It's becoming more of a people way of living. So these books, Ezra and Nechemia, attempt to separate the Jews from the surrounding nations. That was one of the problems we had during all of Sefer Melachim. Malchei Israel, their main chet was assimilation as well. Achav and Izebel. And even in Mamlechet Yehuda with Menashe, idolatry, adopting other gods because you're too close to the surrounding nations. That was Shlomo Melech's sin from the first, towards the end of his life, when he intermarried and he went a little bit too far and was influenced. Hence, he built a shrine for one of the foreign wives. Nechemia builds a wall to distinguish between God's people, Am Sgula, as we mentioned, and the rest of the Goyim. Ezra builds a wall of laws of the Torah that encompasses only Jews and excludes all the Goyim from all this, from the rule. So I think Ezra was very humble and a very modest man. We mentioned during the time of Nechemia, he didn't show his face too much. He said, I'm going to let Nechemia do his thing. I'll be, it's his time now. I'll be there. But he didn't want to overshadow him. And the same thing with Nechemia. They worked together many times when it was needed. All of Ezra's desires were directed towards the people of Israel and towards the Torah. I think he used the Torah not as an end in itself or as a means to differentiate Am Yisrael from everyone else, but as a tool that would bring about redemption of Am Yisrael and its liberation from the yoke of power. But he opened the written Torah so that everyone could see and learn and find their proper relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In Nechemia, we see a dedicated man who constantly worked for the benefit of the Jews. He built a wall for them and makes sure that they are united, expands their economy and opens the borders, but at the same time ensures their security. So from here, we can see two leaders who are supposed to be our role models in their approach to their subjects, their people, Am Yisrael. And the message, in my opinion, is, first of all, their decency, their caring, and their faith in the people of Israel. They don't rebuke them, they don't yell at them, they just try to get them to do the right thing. They're trying to get them to move closer towards the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And as a result, they succeeded in shaping the people and instilling in them unity and faith in God that remains, I think, to this day. So I guess the last sentence that I would say is, it seems from all of the sources, from from all the prakim that we learned, 23 of them, if it weren't for Ezra and Nechemia, it's obvious to me, I hope to you as well, that the face of Yahadut, that we, as we know it today, would be very, very, very different. And we're very lucky to have had them, and we need to emulate them. Halavai, that our leaders, we have a chance to choose our leaders very soon. Just learn from the greatness of Ezra and Nechemia. I want to wish everyone a wonderful week, Shavua Tov, and Shana Tova, and Ktiva v'Chatima Tova.